fall up the stairs. Job number 2, grab a bottle of water and pretend you're Steve Jobs for a minute. Okay, I enjoyed it, even if you didn't. Okay, so thank you very, very much for inviting me back to CHC. It's an honor and a privilege to be here, and I appreciate everything that goes into running this seminar. I genuinely think it's the best of its kind in the world, and it's a huge privilege to play a role. Duncan gave me a challenging topic, and part of the challenge was don't just talk about aviation, and I think I'm going to be the first person, second person not to have a picture of a helicopter in their slides, because I'm going to take you beyond the aviation world. But before we do that, look, it's a big room, there's a lot of people here, we don't all know each other, so I just thought we'd quickly go around the room and get everybody to introduce themselves. I did that mainly for the look on Duncan's face, because you'll see there's these fabulous little orange strips they've given us on the bottom of all of our presentation slides, where we can put subliminal advertising between slides. Right, I come from Cranfield University, and the photograph there is us on a typical rainy November day with people who've been through our various courses over the years. The reason I put that up is partly because working with accident investigators, as I get to do on a daily basis, we try and develop a certain humility, if you will, for the things that go wrong, for the positions that people find themselves in, and for the mistakes that they inevitably make. As Sid Decker once put it, we try and understand why it is that it made sense to them at the time. So to actually try and tackle the question that Duncan's given me today was quite hard, because I realize I try and look beyond why it is that somebody did something and try and understand why they did it in the future. Try and understand why they did it so that in the future we can perhaps suggest some alternative strategies or come up with ways to make their life safer. But also we're making life harder, because this is something else that we're doing at Cranfield, and I thought I'd show this picture off. This is a project we're working on currently with a couple of companies you might have heard of, one called Rolls-Royce, the other one called Aston Martin, both doing some quite radical things here to create a 3-seat luxury vertical takeoff electric vehicle that they hope will be flying within 2 or 3 years. We're going through a period of massive disruption that's coming our way in the aviation industry. There are lots of people aspiring to do some very, very different things in the same airspace that we want to do it. So one of our jobs is to prepare people for a world of aviation that looks rather different to how it currently is. So we should have some important learning points for people to take away. I thought, what should they be? Well, I think we probably all agree on the first one, that in general we think safety is a good thing. And as a corollary, I think we probably all agree that danger is a bad thing. So a couple of clear messages for you to take home from today. It's all very straightforward. I think we can all agree on that. And as a consequence, I congratulate you all on achieving Journalism Course 101 from the world of hindsight, where whatever goes wrong is remarkably obvious. And however complex and how many years it takes to investigate an accident and write a carefully written report that does not allocate blame or liability, the average journalist is perfectly able to find just one cause, usually the last person to touch the spanner or the last person to touch the wheel. Hindsight is a wonderful thing, and we need to be really, really careful when we try and understand people's safety behaviors not to apply that 20/20 hindsight vision, because when we do, the world looks much simpler. The clues, the weak signals become blindingly obvious, and we can't work out why it was that this well-trained, competent, well-rested individual went and made what seems to be a ridiculous decision. And it's every one of us. I should have started this with a safety moment, as is tradition within our industry. So let me put that one in now. And the safety moment goes something like this. The reason I couldn't be here last year is that I couldn't really walk very well, having ruptured my Achilles tendon, doing what turns out to be the most dangerous thing you can do over the age of 30, which is enter the dad's race at school sports day. Now, I say that because anybody who's injured themselves in the dad's race at school sports day finds themselves in an elite club of most of the population, who also have an example of how they or their best friend did themselves a terrible mischief whilst trying not to embarrass yourself in front of your kids. In my case, I did it fairly spectacularly and still went to the Paris Air Show for 2 days, which turned out to be a really, really, really bad decision. But the really bad decision was taking place in the first place. Because if I'd have only gone looking for how dangerous is this innocuous activity that I think I might get involved in, I would have found a wealth of literature of people who'd done exactly this. Where people who are not especially sporty, I know, you're looking at me thinking Olympic athlete trying a new career, but people who are not especially sporty decide, well, I'll do this thing, and at no notice, they get all the dads together, and knowing that it could be dangerous for people to run really quickly, what they did was put in a couple of risk mitigations, make it less dangerous. They got everybody to carry a cup of water on their head, run with a broom between their legs, jump over things. So now a bunch of not very fit guys doing something really unusual, including jumping with no warming up whatsoever, results in an Achilles tendon going snap. Now, the thing I've learned about Achilles tendons, just to share with you, is that the pain feels very much like somebody giving you a kick, which is why, again, if you look at the literature, if you look at the various stories on the internet, you'll find that Achilles tendon injuries tend to be accompanied by people turning around and punching their best friend in the face for kicking them in the back of their leg. So there we go. You all now know something you didn't know. I'm sure that every one of us has got one of those stories where you think, in retrospect, it was a really bad idea. I'm pretty sure my best friend told me not to go in the dad's race. Although in retrospect, what I think he actually said after the dad's race was, I meant to tell you, don't enter the dad's race. That's a really bad idea. So if you remember nothing else today, then in the dad's, mum's, or in just some of your cases, granddad's race, let the other guys do it, okay? Meanwhile, let's drag this back to campus for a minute. And a professor of safety and accident investigation found himself walking through campus a few years ago. And outside of our building, there's this rather wonderful bush. It's quite large. It's probably the size of 3 or 4 of these tables put together. And it had been growing over a number of years. And 2 men from our gardening contractors were doing some work on it. One guy with a hedge cutter, just about this length, and he's stood on one side, hedge cutting like that. And his colleague had a much longer one, had a very long pole, and he was doing the top of it. So they didn't bump into each other whilst they were doing it. The guy who was doing it with the pole did it from the other side. So here he is with a bush in the way, cutting like this over the top, and the other guy stood this plate doing this, and the things. Yeah. So Professor Braithwaite comes up and says, I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm not sure this is a bright idea. I think your friend might be about to cut your head off. And he warmly shook my hand and said, thank you. I think you've saved me there. No, I've misremembered that, haven't I? He looked at me as if to say, what the, who are you? Well, frankly, I'm no one except the person who's about to tell you you're about to chop your friend's head off. I could be the guy that went, yeah, I could see you're about to do that. But there was absolutely nothing about this guy that wanted feedback on doing a task that he'd done for quite literally months without cutting anybody's head off and could therefore prove it to be entirely safe, as Terry would back me up on that. Because I find it weird, or at least on face value, maybe I found it weird that when you offer help to people, they don't always want it. And there's plenty of examples of that in society where we think we've got a really strong message, these are what Australian cigarettes look like these days, that say don't do it, and still people do it. So just giving advice doesn't necessarily mean anybody's interested in receiving it. I don't know if anybody's got a wife as lovely as mine who, before I go away on a trip like this, says, have you got any headache tablets? Have you got any throat sweets? And I said, yes, actually, today I'll take them, because we've all bought packets like this, haven't we? And inside is the goodies. Inside as well. Has anybody ever read one of these, ever? Or like me, do you just think, why is it that regardless of which end of the box you open, the folded over bit's always at your end? Right. We don't do it. Now, it's a little bit different in America. I haven't watched TV since I've arrived, but my previous travels suggest that whenever an advert comes on the television for anything that might make you feel better, it's then required to have somebody at the end of the advert with a different voice that says, may have harmful side effects, such as eyeballs exploding. But it's never useful, is it? That's the bit you tune off and say, headache tablets, I'll buy that. So just because we've got a bright idea and got some information doesn't mean people want it, because they don't necessarily perceive that they have a problem. And that's what I want to talk about, is people who perhaps go on and do something, not realizing what the problem is that they've got. So I'm going to take you around a few different industries as I share some of these examples. So I'm going to talk railways for a little bit, or railroads if you're not quite sure what I'm talking about. So here was an accident that happened in the UK. We had a very famous one at Clapham in 1988. The slightly less famous one happened a year later at a place called Purley. And in this case, a commuter train pulling out of a station was run into the back by another train which went through a red signal that was supposed to be protecting it. And as was the case at the time, when the inquiry looked at what went wrong, they looked very much at the immediate cause. The driver of the train, whose responsibility it was to stop at a red signal, had missed this red signal, had overshot it, and ended up hitting a train. But why did he do that? Well, back in '89, they didn't much care. This guy went to jail. And it was only the thinkers and academics around and various other industries that questioned, well, why are you doing this? Well, let me just teach you railway signals in the space of about 20 seconds. And if you look at the left-hand side, the world would be a happy place if all you ever saw was green signals. But a green signal means something. The green signal means that that section of track is clear and that the next signal is either another green or what we call a double yellow. So you see the two yellows there, okay? And it might be that at the point you pass that signal, it's two yellows, and by the time you get to the two yellows, they've gone green again. And that's how they keep the section of track clear ahead of you. If you see a signal that's double yellow, it means that at that moment, the next signal is currently a single yellow. And a single yellow means that the next signal is currently red. So the reason you've got 4 is to manage speed. Because if you pass a green, you know that at worst, the next signal would be double yellow. So you adjust your speed for the fact that if at double yellow, you can then start to slow from there. Now in this case, this driver had interpreted a single yellow as a double yellow. And when he approached this red signal, he just couldn't brake in time to stop. And depending where you go around the network, the space beyond the red signal is long or short. Depends on things like where stations are built and so on. But there's a little bit of margin. So if you slide past a red, it doesn't necessarily cause an accident. Well, ultimately, in this case, this guy had his conviction overruled. And the reason was, one of the things the judge looked at was, well, why did he go past this red signal? Did he come to work and say, I don't care about red signals today, I'm not going to worry about it? No, this guy's massively invested in getting it right. He's the first guy on the train. He's the guy that's going to run into the back of someone. Now, this guy came to work, and just what he saw pretty much every single day he was at work was double yellows. He never saw a green. The network was so congested that you only ever ran on double yellows. And double yellows would almost certainly clear to the next signal being a double yellow and so on. His life was run by double yellows and a schedule. So if you drove like single yellows when there were double yellows, you'd be late. If you drove on double yellows, you'd be on time, but in this case, he misread one. And when he misread one, the other little bit of margin that was supposed to be in the safety system to help him failed. And the question was, would somebody else have done the same thing that this guy would? Well, absolutely. You know, he wasn't making a decision other than what he thought he was doing every day, which was driving under a system that over time had become less optimal. Just because of the congestion and so on, you ended up in a system that didn't work the way the designers intended, and this guy made a mistake, but that mistake became catastrophic. And there's plenty of evidence of similar things. This one happened in Australia in 2001, an accident where a train drove into the back of another train, and the passengers were only saved from really serious injury because the first train had just released its brakes at the point it hit. So thankfully it wasn't too bad. But in the investigation report, they made these comments. Evidence available suggests strongly that the driver's performance was impaired by a medical condition leading to him being unable to recall events for a period of less than 2 minutes between Maribyrnong River Bridge and a point of collision. For 3 years, this driver had suffered from depression, anxiety state, chronic sleep disorder, intermittent features of post-traumatic stress disorder, episodes of mild paranoia, and a history of self-mutilation. In other words, he was unfit to do his job. So, he should have been stopped, surely, or maybe he should have come forward and stopped himself. Well, of course, the systemic failings here was self-declaration of this problem would prove to probably be the end of his job. he would certainly lose a huge amount of his salary. And you might say, but damn it, man, if this guy was professional in his attitude and safety-minded in his focus, then of course he would have come forward. What, you mean the depressed guy with all those other problems that I've just listed? You think somebody who is anxious, depressed, with a chronic sleep disorder, you think they want to do that? Well, you might want to go away and have a look at the statistics about how many people suffer from depression and mental health and so on. There's plenty of them in this room, I'm sure. And we should question how easy it is for them to make the right call. They need a bit of a hand along the way. And in this case, the system that was there to give him a hand wasn't working properly. You know, the ownership had changed, the medicals that were supposed to be there to catch things like this, they were running behind schedule, and he was about 5 months out of having a medical. The physical systems, the things that were supposed to stop a train if you did fall asleep, well, they turned out not to work either. They were ineffectual in anger. The same thing happened a year later, which is where things start to get really interesting. Another driver suffering from incapacitation, most likely through a migraine and the medication he was taking from that during a particularly stressful time. Yeah, actually, he was known to have a problem. The system didn't really know what to do with it, you know. So even that system that had missed the first guy picked up the second guy, and nobody's quite sure what to do with it. So in terms of a decision, again, two people who probably didn't decide to do a bad thing, neither did they step forward to do a particularly good thing, and the support that was supposed to be there wasn't there to take them to one side and perhaps prevent this from happening. A few years ago at the summit, I talked about this accident, and I don't intend to go through it again, but it's a really fascinating case. I just wanted to go through one aspect of it. And this was an accident that happened early in the morning on a train traveling away from Sydney, and it ended up going around this particular curve at about twice the speed it was supposed to travel. And I think there were 6 fatalities all up, including the driver. But the bit I wanted to mention, there was a lot of discussion in the media about, well, we put 2 people on this train. Anybody from the UK would know that half of our rail network seems to be on strike at any one point because they're threatening to take guards away from trains, and the union pointing out that this is a safety critical feature. Well, on this train there was a guard, and he seemed to have done nothing. Why didn't he stop the train? Why didn't he realize that as this train was going more than twice the speed it should have done, that he should have done something like putting the brake on? Well, again, we need to be very realistic about whether that's actually a possibility. In 30 years of history, they found one example of a guard who'd actually applied a brake on a train. And guess what happened to him? He was punished because he was wrong. So the likelihood of anybody going to do it again. But I think the other thing that was important, and it comes back to this threat of hindsight, I got involved in a very small way supporting the human factors aspect of this investigation. And we ended up in a room with some very tough career railwaymen. And I was there as this young, fresh-faced academic, and we all went around the room, and it was, I've been driving for 45 years, mate, and then I've been an engineer for 30 years, mate. I was like, hello, I work for a university. Before we were allowed to do anything, the guy who was leading the investigation said, I want to put every single one of you in the simulator, and we will play back the last bit of the journey. So the 48 seconds it took from this train to leave a station and get to the point that at 80, 90 kilometers an hour, it toppled over on a hill. He said, I want you to tell me honestly, at what point you say, this is too fast, I'm going to do something about it. It was very sobering. Every single one of us went, and it fell over, right? So to think that somebody was going to do this, well, it's not really a very realistic defense. It was a red herring, if you will. It was something that people focused on with the brilliant benefit of hindsight to go, oh, maybe this guy, maybe this is person, a surviving person that we could focus our anger on. No, actually, he didn't make a decision. He probably barely comprehended the situation he was in at the time it happened. And yet these kind of accidents have happened all over the world, things going around corners too quickly, and the system setting people up to allow them to fail. Whether it's a high-speed train like this, or more recently in the UK, a tram like this. Happened in a place called Croydon early one morning, where a tram ended up going around a curve much, much faster than it should have been. It was traveling at about 45 miles an hour on a curve it should have traveled around at 12. at 73 kilometers. For some of you, at a curve, it should be doing 20 on. And at any speed from 30 miles an hour up, this thing was going to tip over. And when it tipped over, a lot of people got very, very badly injured because the crashworthiness of these things is not great. Because for some reason, we don't think a tram's a train. I mean, why would we do that? We think it's a tram, so it's much more like a bus. So our reference points for safety, the way we think about it, we accept a whole bunch of stuff for that version of, let's call it trains, than we do for other versions of trains. And who would do that in aviation, where we would accept different levels of safety depending on what our aircraft look like? Well, in this case, the focus was on the driver. Why didn't the driver slow the train down? Why didn't he apply the brake? Well, it was quite possible he didn't quite know where he was, because he drove this route all the time, backwards and forwards, backwards and forwards, backwards. It's not a big network. It doesn't get very exciting. I know they say that a train driver's life is really exciting. It's not. Same backwards and forwards. You come through a tunnel, the lighting was poor, the weather was poor, lost situational awareness, and bang, this thing went over. Of course, if we were really interested in this, we look at, and I wonder if the same thing could have happened to somebody else. Were there other drivers who were likely to have been in the same boat? And of course, they looked at the data and said, yeah, it's not happening all the time, but there were lots and lots of occasions where people were going above the speed limit. And what was anybody doing about it, other than keeping on schedule? Now, what was interesting is that the investigation agency looked at, well, what's this company doing in terms of safety management, in terms of looking at the maturity of its safety management? Well, it was quite interesting. They're no cowboy outfit. They were doing some good stuff. They'd had an audit from their regulator, the ORR, who'd done a safety culture audit, and they seemed to find a bunch of stuff that seemed to be pretty good. Because, in part, that's the nature of safety culture, isn't it? The sort of organizations that are good enough to ask you to look at their safety culture is probably doing okay. Because the ones that don't ask you, they're the ones you should really go and look at. So these guys had some focus on, and they seem to have the things that are doing okay. But actually, when you started to look at it in more detail, but there were some areas where, they found that some people were more approachable than others. There was an inconsistency in the way that feedback was enacted upon, and so on. And it starts to translate into some numbers. Here are some interviews they did with 58, in fact, no, it was close to 70 drivers all up that they talked to. They asked about the relationship they had between the line controllers, so their next level of line management, and senior management, to try and explore how much people would ever come forward with safety information. And there is an average rating between 1 and 10, 1 being low. They reckon driver to controller down at 3.9. Driver with senior manager, 3.6. It was not good. People were not actually there for sharing information. And even when that information is out there, it's never going to be a loud shout that we're a really bad group of people. It's more likely to be the quiet whisper that we have a problem with this individual, or these individuals, or this particular base. And the question is whether we choose to ignore it. And Costa, the shipping company, knew that this particular captain was somebody they were concerned about. And yet when it went wrong, the first reaction was to say, I'm sure we didn't know anything about it. Well, I'm not sure that's true. So let's get back to the question and say, where do we start with all of this? Well, for some people on day one, they don't even know that safety is a really important part of their job. And maybe it isn't on face value. Maybe it's only once you start to understand safety that you start to see just how many people play a role in that. And I found this study, which was quite interesting, about young workers and the point in which in their lives they are most vulnerable. And they're most vulnerable when they start, of course, not because they don't know the job especially well, but partly because they don't really feel like they can speak up and challenge yet. And how hard do the rest of us work to make it easy for that person to know when something is not right and say something about it? So I'll share another of my near-death experiences. I've got quite a lot of them to draw upon. And involves a tank, which sounds really exciting until you see that it was actually one that looked like this. But anyway, look, somebody's probably getting excited about that. I worked for an electronics company. It sounds very flash, but they used to employ students in the summer to do the dirtiest of work that you could possibly imagine during the summer shutdown. And they used to take their gas tanks like this, and they'd spend some time to vent them so the atmosphere inside was safe. And then there was a little door at the end. This isn't the original one. I just tried to find a picture that was vaguely close. But the door at the end, you take all the bolts off and you can open it. And they tested the atmosphere inside. And then having placed breathing apparatus and ropes and all sorts around, they arranged for 2 students to go in and sweep all the rust out the inside. It was a very glamorous job. And then when they finished that, then they'd take them out and they'd fill it with nitrogen. And fill it with the nitrogen to test the seal that was on that door before they then put in the real gas. And the best bit of all is that I was not involved in this task. I was involved in another task elsewhere, which involved hosing stuff down, where every time you hosed the floor, it went purple and blue, and other things to tell you that life-threatening chemicals were just sloshing around. Anyway, when they'd finished this job, they found that the door at the end was so far in that nobody could reach in and pull it round. So as I'm walking past, I was quite thin then, they needed somebody thin enough to go in, and the other 2 students had been dispatched off something else, so they just said, Graham, can we just borrow you? We just need you to go in the tank, pull the door around, and then come out again. And I went, yeah, because I'd seen people doing it. I'd seen them there all week. Yeah, it was fine. Yeah, great. So I was halfway in, legs in this far. Somebody came running across the plant. No, stop. Okay, so I did stop. Right. I still didn't think it was a big deal at this point. Of course, what had happened is, since the 2 students had been in, they'd now filled it with nitrogen. And nitrogen likes to just stay there. So what I was going to do is stand up in this thing, take one deep breath of total nitrogen, and I was going to collapse. Right? There was no breathing apparatus because they cleared that away because they'd finished the job the previous day. There was no other second student because they'd now been dispatched to do something else. And the 2 co-workers I were with was both too fat to get through the door to rescue me. So I started to understand over the next couple of days as I met the plant manager and the senior plant manager and the director of the company as they warmly shook my hand and asked me how much I was enjoying working for them and whether I'd like to stay on, that clearly they realized how close they'd got to killing me. Right. I didn't know. Right? You wouldn't expect me to know. Maybe you shouldn't have recruited me in the first place, but it took somebody to challenge it, somebody to say, stop. And interesting that my reaction was just bemusement. It probably should have been gratitude, and it certainly shouldn't have been like the guy on campus who was cutting the grass, right? So when you get somebody new, take advantage of the fact that, as this piece of work showed, their fresh eyes are incredibly valuable because they see things that the rest of us learn not to see, right? We've all done it. We've all learned how to make the system work and so on. I'm sure Matt would smile when I'd say there's plenty of things at Cranfield that I go, well, you know, this is just how it is at Cranfield. And I'm sure your organizations have got plenty of those. You know how to make it work. You know it's a bit crazy. If somebody tried to get you to explain it to them, you couldn't. But maybe you should get somebody to explain it to you. How do you take those people who walk through the door, who see it as being different, without putting them off? I don't know how many people here have moved organizations, but when I moved from the University of New South Wales to work for Cranfield University, I had to stop myself because the number of times I'd say, at University of New South Wales, we used to, and I always thought, this is my valuable experience that you've employed me for. My co-workers hear it as, ooh, University of New South Wales. You know, people don't want to hear it unless you make it so, unless you say, you know, you've been here for 6 months. I know what we told you when we employed you and when we interviewed you. Tell us what you saw. Tell us what this organization looks like to you. Spot the things that we don't see. I had a fabulous experience of this. I was on a cancelled flight. This is a very long time ago, which was supposed to be going up to Aberdeen. And they put 3 or 4 of us in the back of this taxi, and off we went to another airport. And in the back was 2 oil company employees. One was from their graduate scheme, and one was in a more technical role. And the graduate had come from an economics degree or a finance degree or something like that. And he was talking with such pride at being asked about what he saw around the network that was perhaps something that could be improved. And he talked about flying to a particular airport where every time they got off this aircraft, there was a little step that they used to get out because the step at the bottom of the airplane was bigger than it needed to be. And that was always a bit of a, when you got off the airplane, and this particular airport had made a little step. And he thought it was brilliant, and he wondered why all the other airports didn't have it. Well, they didn't have it because nobody ever pointed that out, because if you work at Airport A, you don't fly around going, well, I wonder what we do differently to all the other airports. And if you're the flight crew, you probably don't step on that step. But he, as a passenger, did. He was so proud that somebody had asked him to see something that maybe the rest just didn't see. So find a way to ask people for what they see and not to scare them. Because otherwise people just try and adapt to what's around them. They look for clues, they look for what's acceptable, and so on. And this thing, social proof, is a really interesting concept because we all fall foul of it. It's the way that marketing people get us to buy some of the things that we do. But we do it because we see people who we respect or trust or look up to do something. I'm the one on the left. I'm not sure I've made a great decision there, but, you know, there were at least 2 or 3 people who'd done it and not died in front of me. And I'm on the left, so I'm sure the other guy's in a much worse state. Right? We do stuff, not just because we're young and stupid, but because we look for clues, particularly when we're faced with uncertainty, but also in other circumstances as well. It's one of the reasons that why when an evacuation starts on an aeroplane, you just have to hope that the first lot of people, the most definitive in their actions, head the right direction. Because otherwise, you know, a whole bunch of people are going to follow them in whichever direction they go. Just hope that the first ones off don't decide to take their carry-on baggage, because everyone else will see that as an accepted norm, start to do exactly the same sort of things. When we see stuff that's wrong, I know some people will be familiar with the analogy of broken windows. The former administrator of the FAA, Marion Blakey, used to talk about it. I think it comes from law enforcement. And the observation that in parts of the city where maybe there's factory buildings that are disused and so on, the police observe that if they drive past one day and there's one broken window, if nobody attends to it, then within a week there'll be many more broken windows, and suddenly the whole building will be ruined. If we don't attend to things, then people start to accept things quite easily. You know, when somebody walks across an airport and sees that that's the way to lock the door on the 787, what is it that makes them go, what are we doing to make you think that's okay? Or what are we not doing that could make it a hell of a lot easier for you to do it? So let's look in a different arena altogether. Beautiful Whistler, a place like many others with snow where avalanches occur. And one of the papers I found in trying to understand why people do the sorts of things they do was all about avalanche accidents. A study of 598 avalanche accidents that had happened in the USA. And it talked a lot about heuristics, the simple problem-solving tools that we all use to deal with novel situations, different situations, and so on. And this particular research started to look at, well, what were the factors that were common in people getting themselves into avalanche accidents? And the first one was that, you know, over 2/3 of those happened on slopes that they were familiar with. It was a place they felt comfortable with. They'd been there many times before, and it had not had an avalanche. But also they started to adapt to the people around them and the people that were also going skiing with them. And the fact that if they'd set out to do this, they were much more likely to go through with it. That commitment heuristic says, you know, we've set out to go skiing today, and okay, that's going to push me in the bias of, and that is what we'll do. Because the scarcity thing comes in, and because you rarely get a day as good as today, or I've not got another day to go skiing for another 3 weeks, let's crack on and do it. We've got this rare opportunity, and suddenly let's get out there. And in this industry, again, I think you see a parallel of people saying, look, you know, actually, it's not about people going out there with a willful intent of doing something bad. They sometimes even go out and miss obvious clues because they don't really take into the full account the decision they're taking. Because often it's not a decision. It's not a decision. They don't make this willful decision about whether to do what they do. It's only in retrospect with hindsight that you look at it as an active decision they made. Some of you will be familiar with this accident. It happened in the North Sea back in 1987. 193 people died when the Herald of Free Enterprise, a roll-on, roll-off ferry, set off from Zeebrugge Harbour. And the bow doors were open as it set off, and water started to enter the car deck as it accelerated away from the harbour. And it only took about 3 inches of water to destabilize the vessel, and as it started to roll, it gathered more water, and within 90 seconds, this vessel overturned. And many people died in the icy cold waters, or as they fell through the full width of the ship. A horrendous accident. The media jumped straight away on the assistant bosun, the guy who didn't shut the doors. And we could spend an hour talking about all the many things that went wrong in this. But one of the things that became apparent was actually that quite a lot of ships left port with the bow doors open. It was quite regular practice. In fact, there was a very good reason for doing it. That reason being that having filled the metal box of the car deck with dozens of cars and trucks, you're in this hostile, stinky, diesel fume-filled environment, and a bit of sea air blowing through the vessel was not a bad idea as you started to sail away from the port. On this particular day, the reason it happened to them and not other people was to do with the height of the tide. And as this vessel accelerated away, it created a slight suction force into the water, which just meant there was just enough water came through the bow doors. When they looked at previous events, the same thing had happened. It had set sail with bow doors, and at some point somebody closes them. On this occasion, they didn't, because they found that there wasn't just one person who could do it. In fact, the person who was responsible for it, the accountable manager, couldn't possibly see that the doors were closed because another procedure required them to be in two places at once. Now, the people who normally shut the door was either this guy or this guy, which meant that on this occasion it was neither this guy nor this guy. But for the other people around, they didn't see a moment where they went, we really shouldn't do this with the doors open. It's not like taking off on an airplane. There's a point where you start to think, something's not quite right. Something's starting to go wrong. And what's the point where you're confident enough to say it? When I was a student, I was really lucky. I got to go flying in the flight deck of a 737 for a couple of days with two Australian pilots, so I could get to learn a bit about the industry. And our first leg was Melbourne to Canberra. It's quite a short sector. And they turned around and said, mate, sit there, keep your mouth shut, and then we'll have a chat on the next leg, which is much longer. Brilliant, fine. Anyway, we approached Canberra, and Canberra is surrounded by hills, and it was a beautiful, clear day. And as we circled around Canberra to approach the airport, the airplane started talking. And the airplane said, terrain, terrain, terrain. Now, I've read accident reports, and when you look at the voice recorder, that bit normally comes towards the end. Right? And what did I say about it? Well, I thought, well, they've told me to sit here and say nothing. They're the professionals. They'll know what's going on. I'll keep my mouth shut. Turns out I was right. Otherwise, you see dead people, and that's just weird. There was nothing going wrong there, but I was sat there thinking, yeah, maybe I should say something. Well, on that occasion, I would have been wrong. Different example, one of the Australian investigators came up to Canada when Air Ontario had a crash. You perhaps remember at the late 80s, an aircraft took off with ice on the wings, having not been properly de-iced, and it failed to climb and crashed. And he, as the human factors investigator, found himself on a flight on a public holiday weekend, where there they are at the terminal in the same aircraft type, an F-28, there's snow on the wings, they're waiting to go, he's looking out the window thinking, when are they going to de-ice? And he went to put his hand up to say to the cabin crew, and then he thought, nah, they're just going to look at me and go, ooh, Mr. Accident Investigator, getting too worried about this. So he said, right, I'm not going to say anything. And then he went, oh, like, out of everybody on the entire planet, the person who's doing the human factors investigation into this accident should at least be the person that says, are we going to de-ice? Right? And the answer was yes, we de-ice at the end of the airport here. Thank goodness for that. But it's hard, isn't it? It's hard. And particularly when those decisions don't feel like decisions, particularly when it becomes routinized, not as a violation. We're not talking about routine violations where every day people go in and do something that they know to be bad. Actually, we're talking about the situations where people go to work and think they're doing the right thing. Now, in this case, when Qantas very nearly ruined its amazing safety record by overrunning a runway, it did so on a day where the weather was poor. It did so when it was landing with idle reverse thrust, which it was quite entitled to do, and it was landing with the flaps in a reduced flap setting and so on. All things that were okay and had been risk assessed individually, but were never meant to all be used together in this circumstance. But everybody becomes so routinized into doing it that way that they didn't really see the decision on that day. So let's look at another sector. If you have a look at the Bristol Royal Infirmary, a hospital in the UK, you will see that it was involved in a very tragic scandal surrounding a specialist cardiac unit that was there as part of its pediatric centre. And more babies died in surgery over a 14-year period than the rest of the sector, even though this was a specialist unit. Now, there's some really interesting papers on this. If you are interested, go and have a look. at the topic, and particularly this Week in Sutcliffe paper. Because what you see is that here was a unit that didn't know they were doing a bad thing. They thought they were doing a good thing. You know, they were a good team. They thought they were doing well. They were improving year on year, but not in the context of where they should be and in the context of others within the sector. Okay? I know it's a long passage. I picked out a couple of words in this. They had a prevailing culture around optimism, around learning curves, around gradual improvement over time. And what it meant was over that period of time, they drifted so far away from what was good in the sector. They did so without necessarily realizing it. This wasn't bad people. This was good people thinking they were doing a good job, but lacking that different perspective to say, well, no, actually, you know, you could be doing this a lot better. Have a look over here. Have a look at these people. That's what they're doing. You could maybe do something better. And it's being careful not just to look with hindsight, as I say, at the things that happened in the past and saying, well, I think we could do a better job of that. That's something you've got to be really careful of too. You need to put yourself in the shoes of saying there, but for the grace of God go I. Not how on earth could this happen to them, but how could this happen to us? How genuinely might this happen to us, and what would we do about it? And that takes safety leadership. Some of you may know that this happened last year, and again, there's some really useful materials on this. I don't know if Sarah Flaherty's somewhere in the room. The proceedings of this are being written up and published for free by OECD, and is well worth a look. And they took people from a range of different industries and got them together to talk about safety management. And as always, the aviation people perhaps thought they knew more about it than the rest of the room, and went away realizing that there were some other very powerful perspectives that they should listen to. And one of the people that spoke was Dan Marino, not the one that played for the Miami Dolphins, but the one who was the head of human factors for ICAO, and was the one who was behind what we now see as their safety management manual and ultimately ICAO Annex 90. And he spoke quite angrily, actually, about a world that had stopped talking about safety management as anything other than a safety management system. And there was this focus on systems for everything and training people in the system rather than training them on all the other things that are important to safety but are not necessarily about the management system. He wrote a very good paper, which I would commend to you to read, and which you can download from that URL for free. But one of the things he spoke reasonably angrily about was this temptation we have to make everybody responsible for safety and start to deliver a message that lacks clarity about actually who carries a true accountability and responsibility for something. That it becomes not that everybody has a role to play, which is absolutely right, but that we're clear about who it is in the leadership team who has the responsibility to resource something, to make sure that something is right and something is going to happen. So I do think it's important that everybody sees a reason to be involved, to own, be invested in it, and so on, but not if it means that it's now no longer clear who it is that needs to set the target, who it is that needs to resource something, how that it needs to progress from here. And I think that was a really, really good point. You know, if it comes to a senior leadership team, again, Dan made some comments about what the senior management team must do. And probably the biggest ones of these is around resource. So make sure that those who really understand, whether it's the frontline team who've got an idea to solve a problem that only they truly understand, or whether it's for a much higher level safety program, that they are suitably resourced, supported, and that those making those senior decisions take evidence-based decisions as to how to allocate their resources. It's a tough job. Duncan was kind enough to mention that when I'm not at Cranfield, I get to do interesting stuff with airlines like TUI and with British Airways. And I'm fortunate enough to have that brief to go anywhere, talk to anyone, ask anything. And in doing that, the reason they do it is because I'm fabulously naive to everything that has gone before within their organization. And all of those things that they've learned to fail to see, all of those things that have just become the way we do things around here and is normal. And this is no superpower on my part. There's plenty of other people playing roles like this. I know Dave Pryor has done something similar, where somebody comes in and asks questions which sometimes have a blindingly obvious answer, and other times lead to that special face that says, yeah, I don't know why we do it that way. Why? How do other people do it? And to create a culture that says, when something happens to someone else, can we go and look at it in intense detail and say, what do we do when something like this happens to us? Because it can, absolutely. And how do we support people to see when things are starting to head in the wrong direction and do something about it? So what? Well, I wanted to try and summarize on a slide some of the things I want you to take away. And the first thing is from my love of the job of accident investigators. The people that come in when everything has gone wrong and try to draw together many, many different qualities to understand, to tell the story, to come up with an understanding of why, but most of all, to come up with ideas proactively as to how to stop it happening in the future. And remember the importance here of being humble to hindsight. It makes so many things become decisions where they weren't decisions, obvious when they were not obvious, clear when they were not clear. So if you really want to learn from the things that have gone before us, we need to do it absolutely with humility. We need to look after the new guys, whether they're new as CEO or new as the person sweeping the hangar floor. We need to look after them because it's hard for them to tell us when something is not right. And actually, better than that, they can probably see a whole bunch of stuff that we don't see that doesn't make sense to them. And even if we have to explain to them that there's a really good reason why we do it the way we do it, then sometimes it's useful to go back and actually give that explanation. As a teacher, you find you learn much, much more by trying to teach somebody else than you do just sitting there reading books and so on. Because if they can't understand it, you're just not doing your job. Okay? Ask people for feedback before they grow blind to it, and accept that sometimes these conversations are tough. I had a conversation last week with the CEO and chairman of a certain airline, and I walked away and I thought, have I annoyed him a bit? And the comment that somebody made is, that's your job. You're supposed to annoy him for a bit. If you don't have a conversation about safety where you annoy the boss every so often, you're probably not having the right kind of conversations. You know? I'm not saying be obnoxious about it. Don't all go over and start being mean to Carl. But Carl doesn't just want you to come over and be nice to him the whole time either. He wants to know what's really happening. Am I right? Good. That's relief. Because other speakers have been nasty to the CEO in the past, and it never goes well. Anyway, consider why somebody would tell you something. Right? Make it easy for them to do it. Think about what the reward is. The reward is mostly that you get some feedback and some change happens. But if the reward is you never get feedback and we never do anything about it, the message is, please don't tell me again. So you need to make sure that it's valued. But you might also want to think about, well, why wouldn't somebody tell us this? Well, they wouldn't tell us because it's not obvious to them. We haven't told them to look for it. They haven't told us because they're worried about their job. They're worried about paying their mortgage. They're worried about putting food in front of their kids. They're very legitimate worries. They may have a mental health issue. Many of us do, and need to overcome the fears that perhaps go with that. So go looking for trouble. Right? Go look for the things that are not going right and expect it to look subtle. You know? I think in safety, all the easy stuff's been done. Right? If you wanted to do a really easy job in safety, you should have been at a conference like this 30 years ago when there had been 30 people in the room and there was some really low-hanging fruit for us to go get. Actually, it's not low-hanging anymore. It's subtle. It really is subtle. And you need to be creative. Because if you don't, when it happens, it will look very obvious to everybody else with hindsight. Suddenly they will say this was absolutely foreseeable. So the last thing is to say, continue to show courage. Courage as a leader and courage as a follower, because each of us play that role. Sometimes it's for us to humbly suggest something that needs to change, and sometimes it's for us to make sure that we put our big boy pants on, come to work and say, we will do this, we will spend money on this, we will interrupt the business if we have to, but it matters. Thank you very much.